session 2 this week. So hopefully you were all able to attend last week, or if not, we did upload the presentation. So you could go back and look at the presentation as well. Couple quick items before we do get started here today. Just a reminder, it would be helpful to keep your mic muted unless you're talking at the time. And do have your chat bar open. We'll, as in last session, like to use that. If you've got any questions, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. And there's a lot of activity usually going on. We'll keep track of that, and we'll also do question and answer periods where we can talk about some of those items, especially the ones that didn't get answered within the chat. I think we've covered most of these items already. If there happens to be anything, the root cellar, if there happens to be anything that we know is going to be covered in future sessions or kind of outside of this class, we will put those items in the root cellar and then follow up with you later on those. So today we've got a handful of staff members, people presenting. Myself, Candy Maestri, Judith is our Zoom host. Wendy is our chat moderator today, I do believe. Actually, Jennifer might be the chat moderator today. And Frank is coordinating the breakout sessions. And we have Brenda, Leah, and Lynn talking about a lot of great topics tonight. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on soils, composting and fertilizer, why that's really important, and then talk about planting itself through seeding and planting transplants. So as I mentioned, this is session 2. We have 2 more the following 2 Tuesdays, caring about plants and harvesting and storing. Before you launch the breakout rooms, let's talk a little bit. So today we're going to do the breakout rooms first, a little bit different than we did last week. And then we'll do presentations towards the end. So we're going to do 12 minutes of breakout rooms, and we think we've got it figured out so that you'll get a 1-minute warning. But I would ask that the chat or the breakout room moderators keep track of the time just in case. So the homework assignment for last week was to put a sketch together of your yard, not necessarily the plantings, but just your yard in general. So if you have that and you want to share it, you could show it if you wanted to, but you don't have to. But would like to chat about your yard sketch. What kind of challenges did you identify as you were laying that out? And what kind of things did you consider? And I can put all of these items in the chat as well if the breakout room coordinators would like. So with that, Judith, I think you can go ahead and
okay, let's do it.
Finish the breakout session. So building healthy soil and container soil. And
all right, that is me. So we're going to talk about building healthy soil. We all have clay soil, so we all have the same problem for the most part. The resources for this is the Seed to Supper course book, chapter 2. I also included 2 extension handout, one from WSU and one from Oregon State University. And they are a bit intense. I think the WSU one is like 24 pages long on soil. It's pretty intense, but if you really want to read it, go for it. You can go on.
okay.
All right, so I think the first thing when we talk about soil is to really understand we're not just talking about dirt, we're talking really about the whole structure of soil. And that's what's really important for plants when it comes to their growth. And so soil is really made up of the air that is also in the soil, water, organic material, and broken pieces of rock. And those broken pieces of rock are what really determines the type of soil that you have. So obviously gravel is large pieces of rock, but then sand is the next largest piece of rock, followed by silt and clay, getting from bigger to smaller. And so how big those pieces of rock are depends on how much room you have for air and water within your soil. Next slide. So in your soil, roughly 50% of it should be made up of just space, and that space should be taken up by air and water. The solid part of your soil is that broken rock, which is either gravel or sand, silt, or clay. And then 2% or so of it is organic matter. And even though organic matter is only 2%, it is very, very important and vital to your soil. And so organic matter is really anything that was once living and is now decomposing in the soil. Some people will also lump kind of all of the living organisms in your soil in that organic matter content as well. That organic matter is what really helps your soil accept and keep water in it. So in our clay soil, obviously it gets rock hard in the summer and it's a slippery mess in the summer, in the winter and in the spring. And increasing that organic matter is what allows our clay soil to have and hold water in the summer and allows it to actually drain some of that water off in the winter. And so organic content of our soil is one of the main things we'll talk about improving when it comes to improving our clay soils. Also, when we increase organic matter, we're also increasing the number of organisms in our soil, which also helps loosen up that clay soil. And in your garden, it helps bring nutrients to your roots to have more organisms in the soil, and to be breaking down that decomposing matter gives your plants something good to eat. Next slide. So in the middle, we have this really beautiful soil I think any of us would love to have. It is obviously healthy soil. You can see it from a mile away. It is that really dark, rich color. It's what we would call loamy soil. You can actually see the roots growing in it. It is like the most gorgeous soil that most of us don't have. A lot of us have problem soils, and so some of the problem soils are around the edge. So in the top left, we have cracked soil, which is what happens to that clay soil in the summer. It becomes rock hard. When we said clay is the smallest particle, that means in the summer when the water disappears, it becomes hard, really, really hard and difficult to dig in. Versus in the spring right now, my yard has big puddles in it in different places. And that's also a problem with drainage that happens with clay soil. We don't, many of us have sandy soil, like in the bottom left hand. The problem with sandy soil is often that it's not holding water and it's free draining too much, and it doesn't give plants anything to drink the rest of the time. And a problem that a lot of us might run into but be unaware of is the bottom right hand, which is compaction in our soil. So if you live in a house that's been constructed within the last 10 years, there's a good chance any of the soil around your house is completely compacted because they were driving machinery through it, even in your yard. And that's also why we're pretty particular about trying not to walk on our garden beds, because that compaction squishes the space where the air and the water needs to be in the soil for your roots to breathe and drink. And so we want to avoid compaction in our soil. Next slide. Actually, before I move on from the last slide, kind of the one thing I want anyone to really understand about soil is healthy soil acts like a sponge, like a dish sponge, literally. So it's got all those air pockets in space, and yet it can still hold a lot of water while being fluffy like a sponge. And what we don't want at any point in time is for that sponge to be squished. We want it to maintain those pockets to really hold air and water. That's one of the most important things that your soil can do. And that's why we talk a lot about organic content, because it's going to increase that ability for your soil to act like a sponge. All right, now container soil. So the most important thing with container soil is you really probably need to be using potting soil. And there's a couple of reasons why we use potting soil in a container. It has added nutrients to it that are easy for the plants to pull up, because in your garden, because there's a natural biome there, there's other organisms living in the soil, it automatically is kind of decomposing material, bringing in new nutrients regularly. That doesn't happen in a container. So it has to have the kind of soil that's already fairly rich for your plant. The potting soil is sterilized before it gets to you. So they basically cook it and make sure there's no weeds and seeds growing in it already. And that's not true of any garden soil you pull up. And it is lighter weight than topsoil. And the reason it's lighter weight are all those little white particles. When I was younger, I used to think they were styrofoam. They're not. They're perlite, which is a volcanic glass that's lightweight, because when you have a container, if you fill it with garden soil, it will be significantly heavier than if you fill it with potting soil. And if you need to move your container, you really don't want it to be that heavy. So garden soil itself just doesn't quite have enough nutrients to keep your container plant alive. And if you have container soil and you've used it this season, next season, you probably need new container soil. Now, some of us fudge this and just replenish, maybe dump half of it out and keep half of it in. We've all done it. But it's recommended really that you entirely replace it. Now, if you have container soil that you're getting rid of, what I do is I actually put it in my compost and let it compost with everything else, get refreshed, and then I can use that compost in the garden next year. So it doesn't go to waste, but you should be changing out your container soil each year. And that's the one place that container gardening can get a bit expensive is if you're having to buy new soil each year. So next we're going to go to the store and be overwhelmed by soil. So when you want to buy soil, there's really two ways that it comes. It comes in bags at the store, or you can have someone deliver you a truckload of soil. And I have done both of them, and neither of them is easy or fun, really. So when you're buying soil, if you go to the soil website, they'll just have a list and you kind of have to pick through what you're going for. You are aiming for either garden topsoil, or it will say potting soil, and they'll also sell compost. So you need to make sure you kind of are starting to create categories in your head of the type of thing that you're buying. You can go to the next slide. So the first thing I want to say is, even though these are pictures of bags, this is not me recommending this brand over any other brand. This is me sneaking into a local garden store and taking pictures of their product so we can talk about it. Because I have often wandered into the soil section and just been totally overwhelmed and been like, what do I need? Or I'll send my husband and he'll come back with a completely wrong thing. So these are just pictures of when you're walking into the garden store and, oh my gosh, what do I buy? So you can see in the pink bag on the left, that is potting soil, and it's labeled as indoor outdoor potting, but still we're mostly talking about using those in containers. I will say I still have used it occasionally outside if I need to kind of refresh a hole that I'm planting something in. I'll use potting soil for all sorts of stuff, but it's potting soil. And it is going to probably have perlite and additives. It usually is going to have wood chips in it and some soil in it. And the blue one next to it is also potting soil. And what is the difference between premium and not premium? I can't tell. I flipped both these bags over and read them, and I still couldn't tell the difference between what was premium about one and not about another. So I don't have good advice on premium versus not premium potting soil. Topsoil is in the brown bag. Topsoil is really meant to be soil, like garden soil that's going in your garden beds in the ground. It's not going to have things that like perlite that are going to make it lighter, but it should have some compost mixed into it. It should be fairly rich if it is a good topsoil. You can go to the next one. All right, on the left-hand side are things that my husband have accidentally picked up when I've sent him out for soil. So steer manure is one of them. He hasn't picked that one up. He has accidentally picked up compost and chicken manure and other random things instead of soil. I don't know how it happens, but I've gotten them brought home at different times. So that left-hand slide is steer manure and chicken manure or compost. And the green bag is purely compost. So this isn't potting soil. Compost is just that organic matter we were talking about. And I make my own compost, but I also usually supplement and don't have quite enough and buy compost too for my garden. And you can go to the next slide if there is one. That's all. All right. Is there any questions about soil? It's complicated and not. Let me pull up the chat. Let's see. I see stuff. Was there anything else?
There was a question. What about raised beds? Does the soil need to be replaced in a raised bed?
The soil doesn't need to be replaced in a raised bed. Raised beds, depending on where you put it, have some access to the soil below them. Raised beds do tend to build up a biome of things. I personally refresh my raised beds each year with additional compost. And you'll notice the soil does kind of tend to compact itself as the season goes on. So I refresh my beds each year, but I don't generally replace my soil in my raised beds. I do make sure to rotate my raised beds to try to make sure my vegetables are using different nutrients, or we're not perpetuating kind of disease cycles with the same plant in the same raised beds.
Okay.
Oh, I like that question. It says, can you cheat and use old potting soil? Because I do have smaller containers. Can you dump the smaller containers in the raised bed, or should I just compost that? Someone else asked that question.
I've done it. I don't think there's anything that says that you can't do it. Does anyone say you can't put potting soil in your garden when you dump out your old ones?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
All I know is do not bother to put your potting soil in the garbage. Find somewhere. I mean, I just dump it in a bed, any bed, right? You might as well use it somehow.
Use it. Okay. Awesome.
Any other questions in the chat, or anybody have any questions before we move on?
I have one more question. I am planning on building an additional garden in an area that the soil is probably pretty compacted because it's closer to the house, and we've been doing yard work in that area with tractors, but it's going to be a raised bed garden. Will that be a big concern, or do you suggest like doing the beds a little deeper so there's more fresh soil?
So what will happen over time, depending on what you're growing and what cover crops you use, the first season, if you're not dealing with the compacted stuff, you're basically dealing with the amount of soil you're adding to your garden. So as long as you're not growing anything that needs to be deeper than that, where you're going to hit your hard dirt, you're more or less okay. So sometimes you'll run into problems with obviously like parsnips, carrots, some types of potatoes, depending on what you're growing. But as seasons go by and the organisms that live in the soil, the earthworms and stuff, they will actually work into that dirt and actually loosen up some of that compaction over time. And there's some cover crops and stuff that are specifically planted to break up some hard soil. So there's ways around it.
Okay.
You can still plant into it. Just be aware of how deep your plant is growing.
Yeah. And then you mentioned cover crops. I've never put a cover crop in my raised bed because I'm always just like, how the heck do I till this in when it's planting time? So have you done cover crop in raised beds? How do you do it? Do you
Is that a now question or a later question? Any other leaders?
I think we handle cover crops later.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Very good. Why don't we go to the next topic? We can talk about compost. Leah.
There. So this sort of follows up on the last topic of sort of what can you add to your garden beds to really improve the growth of your plants. And so as Brenda mentioned, adding organic matter to your soil is probably in this area one of the most important things that you can do to make the environment, the growing environment, good for your young plants. So just repeating, I understand I'm repeating this, but just because it's so important, when you increase the organic matter in your soil, then you're allowing your soil to hold moisture. You are attracting beneficial organisms like earthworms, basically kind of providing food for them, which then provides more space for air in the soil, which then allows more air to be able to get down to the roots and allows the roots to be able to expand out more on your growing plants. And then in terms of protecting the environment, if the water was just running right off of your beds, then it might be running off with some of the nutrients that you're adding to your soil, and it could get into waterways. And so basically, compost or having organic matter in the soil in your garden is helpful in all those levels. Next slide. So I actually really like making our own compost. So I've seen all those bags of compost at the store, but I have to say that in the 20 years that I've been vegetable gardening, I have never bought a bag of compost. So my husband and I do make our own compost. It's cheaper. When you're gardening, you have a lot of organic material around the yard. It also, as many of you might use compost as well to recycle the nutrients from your food waste back into your garden. You do have to think about really what's your purpose for having a compost pile. Some people having a place to put their food waste is really their only purpose, and they're not really trying to make that nice, rich garden soil. But I'm just going to assume that everybody here would like to have some of that nice, rich stuff to help support their plant growth. Next slide. So here is a photo that one of our master gardeners took of some different composts from some different sources. And while I'm talking, maybe just take a look at them and see what differences you notice in them. The one at the top is from the PRC, which is our local out at the dump place where the yard debris waste gets turned into compost. And the PRC compost actually turns up in the supply in some of those large piles that Brenda was showing at some of the soil, I don't know what's the word for that, landscape supply stores. And then I think the middle one is a kind of a typical garden compost. I don't know if that one came out of a bag or that was one that somebody made. And then finally, the one in front is a worm compost. And I think one thing you might notice is there's a different amount of woody debris in each of them, depending on how many sticks and things were in your compost. It may or may not break down as nicely. You might notice differences in color. And then if you felt them, you'd probably notice differences in texture. Like it looks to me like the worm compost is kind of like the most spongy and softest looking. So the texture of your compost does make a difference. Next slide. So if you're making your own pile, there are several strategies, but this is kind of like a basic strategy. And you'll see that there's actually a couple of different strategies in your book, but layering of materials is kind of a good basic method. So it matters. I'm afraid I'm not a soil scientist, but it does matter kind of how much green material you're using in your pile and how much brown material. And so layering is a nice way to kind of make sure that you're having about the right combination of those materials as you make your compost. For example, in our compost pile, we often will use dry leaves as the brown layer. We are one of those people who get a shipment of leaves dumped off at our house. We made a space for that in our driveway, but you can break up leaves in the fall and have a pile in your yard and keep those. And then for green layers, like grass clippings are just perfect in terms of something that you can use, but lettuce, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds. The green is high in nitrogen, whereas the brown is high in carbon. So as you layer, when you're making a compost pile, you do need a fair amount of mass in order for it to undergo the process with the bacteria and the worms that creates the decomposition through a cycle of heating up and then slowing down and cooling down. You also, in order to have that process, need water. So when you're making the pile, kind of water as you go and continue until you have a fairly big pile, like 3 feet high, like a good amount of mass. And then basically it just takes time. So here they say, let it sit 1 or 2 weeks. And I wish that they meant like in 1 or 2 weeks, you'd have that beautiful finished compost, but really no. When 2 weeks isn't really going to be enough time to get your compost all the way through that process. But in 1 or 2 weeks, then you can go out there, you can stir your compost, and that allows the moisture content to kind of stay adequate, because so the top of your pile doesn't dry out and the inside of your pile is containing the moisture. When you stir it around, you're moving the moisture throughout the pile. You can add some more water to kind of keep it moist, but not wet, but not like drenching wet. And you're also putting air into the pile, which then allows for the right kind of bacteria to thrive in there and help with the decomposition. Next slide. So we just got a few pictures of like a pretty compost pile. This is one of the compost piles that people will build where there's like a structure holding up the pile on the sides. These are great and can help keep your garden organized. You don't have to have a structure built. Next slide. And then here's a layer of brown being added. Next slide. So again, this is one of the fancy setups where you create a couple of bins next to each other. And this one is made out of recycled materials, which is, I think, why it's shown. And one way to just organize, kind of keep yourself organized that you're turning your pile is you can shift the compost from one of the bins to the next. We actually do this with a hole in the ground at our house. We have a hole in the ground on one side and another on the other, and just move it back and forth without having a structure, but the structure is nice. Next slide. It does take a while to get to this and some work. I'd say we turn our pile like even once or twice a week and get finished compost in a couple of months. And we can go through maybe 3 cycles to get to finished compost throughout the season. And then the last batch that's looking rich like that will store in like a garbage container over the winter, like more like a plastic garbage bin. That way, like the nutrients don't run off with the rain, and we have some compost for planting in the spring. Next slide. But what do you do with it? So this is great, ideal, add 2 at 6 inches every year before planting. So, if you have one raised bed, maybe that's something that you could accomplish with your compost. But if you have a larger garden and you don't have a full 2 to 6 inches of compost, you can also use the compost localized around the plant. So you can add some compost to the holes when you're planting, and you can, for example, for corn or for broccoli, I'll create a mound of compost around the base of the plant, and that also helps the plant quite a bit. I guess that's probably your perennials also might like it. You can put the compost on top around the plant. So that's what they mean by top dressing. Next slide. All right. I think we'll just skip to questions later. So for fertilizing, so one thing that we really wanted to get across to you is that the best way to know whether you actually need to add fertilizer is to do a soil test. So you can garden without a soil test, but if you want to know, like, should I even be spending money on fertilizer to help my plants? If you do a soil test, it'll measure the pH, like whether your soil is more acid or more basic. It'll measure the nutrients in your soil, which we're going to talk more about, the NPK. Depending on the test, I think, Judith, were you saying that the extension desk has free testing for pH, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And then they also, you can get a list of all the different laps in the area for a complete soil test.
Yeah, and they can be picked up and bought too. I mean, some of us are trying to keep our gardens as inexpensive as possible, so it's always good to know of a free resource. And then, yeah, you can pick up these inexpensive tests, or you can go all the way to having soil analyzed. And I think we have a link for you. We can put in the chat of some soil laboratories if you really want to know the details about what's in your soil and which of these fertilizers that we're going to talk about that you need. Next slide. But when we look at fertilizer, plants need quite a range of nutrients, but so I think maybe like 16 nutrients, but nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are like the three main ingredients that plants need in the most amount. And when you look on the bags of fertilizer, you're going to see those how much of each of those are in there in order: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And that's representing the amount of available nitrogen, then available phosphorus as a percentage of the fertilizer, and then available potassium. In our area, most soil has enough potassium in it already, and so it isn't really necessary to add that. Next slide. So you can buy conventional fertilizers, but I can see a lot of people here use organic fertilizers. So in those organic fertilizers, the ingredients you're going to see in there that are high in nitrogen are like the blood meal or the feather meal, or it might even be a seed meal like alfalfa meal. I think in one of the classes someone asked about a vegan fertilizer, and you don't have to use animal products in the fertilizer. Most of us would prefer to pick up an all-purpose fertilizer, but there are recipes out there to make your own organic fertilizer as well. And then rock phosphate is a source of phosphorus, and then things like kelp meal have those like other nutrients that are in smaller trace amounts. Next slide. With fertilizing, though, there are several different ways to apply it. And so when we look at those powdered organic fertilizers, you can apply the fertilizer in several ways. So broadcasting is when you apply the fertilizer to kind of like to your whole bed. You're shaking the fertilizer on as you're preparing your bed. But you can also apply the fertilizer sort of in a band. If you're planting, say you're planting in a row, you can just apply a band of fertilizer to that one area. And then side dressing is when you have your plants already in the ground, you can sort of shake a little bit of fertilizer around the plants, and that's the type of fertilizing that you do mid-season, often when your plants are already in the ground and you want to add a little bit more. And finally, there are a number of plants that really benefit with just a little bit of organic fertilizer in the whole, and I think that that you'll hear more about that later today, so I won't talk about that too much. But with the dry organic fertilizer, you can apply it when you're first preparing the bed, right before planting, during planting. But some plants also benefit from some additional fertilizer, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, heavy nitrogen during leaf development, and then can use some of the phosphorus during flower development. And I often will use something like a liquid fish fertilizer to sort of give my plants a boost once they're in the ground and give them a little bit of extra nitrogen that way. Next slide. And then during the growing season, I guess sometimes people often ask, this is like one of those frequently asked questions, like, my plant doesn't look good, does it need fertilizer? So some of the things you can look for are kind of pale yellow-green leaves, and just like a general slowdown in growth. But just, I think what I would caution is, you've got these master gardeners. I would take a picture of your plant and talk to a master gardener about it, because there can be situations where you could have too much fertilizer and your plant isn't looking good too. So, so you might consider, if your plants aren't healthy, also reaching out and getting some help. Next slide. All right, got to questions.
Fabulous. Do we have any questions in the chat, Wendy? Or anybody that would like to ask a question?
I think we're caught up in the chat.
Anything master gardeners want to add? I know that there's a wealth of knowledge about compost and fertilizer here.
I have a quick question, actually. So you had mentioned to not add weeds to the compost. What if they haven't gone to seed yet and it's just like the green foliage of the weed? Is that okay? Like if you pull it when it's young, or is it no weeds at all?
For me, I do my weeding into my yard debris bin. It's going to depend on the weed, and so if you really know the nature of the plant that you're putting in your compost pile, for example, I have the horrible problem of having bindweed, and I would never want to put bindweed into my compost pile, because my compost pile, I don't know that it would get hot enough to really, that I would feel safe, that I wasn't spreading those little bits of bindweed around. And so, you know, it kind of depends on what you call a weed. If your weed is grass, then, you know, you might feel comfortable doing that.
Okay, because I read in this super old school book that my uncle gave me, the guy who wrote the book, I don't remember his name, but he would weed his garden and wait until they were big enough to pull, but then leave them in the garden to add organic matter back to it. And so I did that last year with just the really small, like not deep rooted weeds, and like within a couple days, you know, they were gone. And I was like, whoa, because it always like stressed me out to you pull the weeds and you get them as far away from the garden as you can. But I guess that makes sense, knowing which weed it is. And
yeah, it depends on your weeding. And I think we will talk even a lot more about weeding in next week or the week after. So
cool.
Okay.
So here's a good chat question about general soil and soil health. To till or not to till?
Oh yeah, till or no till, that's a good one. We should mute ourselves.
Anybody want to answer that one?
So
I will jump in and maybe someone else can say something. So I own a tiller, and I will give you a reason not to use it. So tillers do a good job of churning up the soil, but what a lot of people don't realize is as it's churning up, it has a tendency to compact the soil under the spot where it's churning. And so that's a challenge. It doesn't make it unusable necessarily, but that can be a problem. The other thing that happens when you're tilling is your soil has a structure, and that structure is what lets it hold water and hold air and hold nutrients. And by churning it up, you're disrupting the structure of your soil. And so that's why more people over time are leaning towards no-till. You're still allowed to till, no one's gonna arrest you, do what you want, but like, but there's pros to going no-till, and those are that you're not compacting the soil, and that you're keeping that soil structure healthy. Wendy, did you have anything else to add?
So how would you maintain a large in-ground garden without tilling?
That would be one of the reasons you till something.
Okay.
I mean, there are just, it's times that it would make sense, I think.
Okay. Like if you plant a cover crop or whatnot, you have to get that in the ground somehow.
Yeah.
But also if you are going to till, being really wise about when you're doing that, because if the soils are too wet, then it's exactly what Brenda said. It
Yeah.
compacts it. So you need to wait. It's hard because you want to get out there. I've been in that situation. You want to get out there and get going, but you gotta wait.
Yeah, we did that last year. We tilled one of our areas too soon and it was very sucky the rest of the year.
So I will say, in our breakout room, people were creating new beds, new raised beds. And that's the one time that I think is important to till, because if the ground is really compacted to start out with, if you till initially and get the weeds growing out so you can remove them because it's churning up new seeds, and then and water it, and then get all those weeds out, and then add your amendments and compost and everything else on top of it, and then don't walk on it and don't compact it after that. So I don't know, I'm in favor of tilling initially because my soil was so awful. And then you can plant things, Tess was asking about cover crops. You can plant things like those deep-rooted dicone radishes that will go really deep, and then they die when it freezes, but it's created air channels and organic matter into that not so great soil below.
Great tip. Okay, very good. Well, how about we talk about planting? Now we've talked about how to prepare our soil. Lynn.
Okay. This is sort of the basics of planting, and it's one of the more fun parts of having a garden is putting seeds or plants in the ground and waiting to see what happens. You can grow from seeds or you can grow from transplants. And there are advantages of each. Seeds are usually less expensive than starts. A package of seeds is $3 or $4, and starts can be that much for just 6 plants in a 6-pack. So they're less expensive, and you have far more choices of varieties of whatever you're planting, whether it's lettuce or tomatoes or whatever. You have many more choices of types of crop to plant. Also, that $3 or $4 you spend for a package of seeds gets you a package of seeds that's usually good for more than 1 year. If you buy a package of zucchini seeds, you are not going to use all those seeds in 1 year. So it can last more, and next year you may not have to buy any at all. Okay, next slide. The other option is transplants, which also have some advantages. If you have long season crops or crops that really need the heat, the transplants are the way to go. For example, with tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, those need the heat and you can't plant them early in the season. So those you plant so that they can mature. Also, the plants that you transplant are better able to compete with the weeds because they're bigger than the little weeds that are coming up. So they have a better opportunity to get the nutrients, where little baby seedlings are really competing with any weeds you have in your garden. Next slide. So you have to decide whether you're going to do seeds or transplants. This table is in your textbook. I've got pages on a lot of the slides, so you'll know where it corresponds in your textbook. Things that are typically planted by seed are things like beans and peas and squash, things that have larger seeds, plus things that plants that you're eating the roots of, like radishes and beets and carrots. And then there's some miscellaneous others. I mean, we talk about seeds for garlic, but they're not really seeds, they're cloves. Likewise, they may call them seed potatoes, but they're not seeds. hit the next slide. I mean, hit the, it's animated, it will come. Thank you. Things that you really want to transplant, you don't want to plant here by seed, or the tomatoes and peppers and eggplant that we already talked about. They just don't have enough time to mature. And finally, there are things where you can go either way. For example, kale, you can plant that from seed and it will mature. Things like spinach, you'll see spinach starts at the nurseries, but it's just as well to plant those by seed. Onions, well, you have lots of choices with onions. You can plant seeds, you can plant the sets, you can plant the little bunches of seeds that look like dried up green onions, or you can grow starts and plant little baby onions. It's like planting a blade of grass, but that's what I have the best luck with. And again, this is in your textbook if you forget. Next slide. So if you're going to use seed, the first thing you need to do is pay attention to the seed packet, because it has basically all the information you need. This is an example of a tomato seed packet. This is in your book, and unfortunately it's for tomatoes, which I just said don't plant from seed, but you may plant them indoors. Anyway, the seed packet will tell you what kind of vegetable it is, what variety it is. So this is gold nugget variety of tomato. And you see there on the front, it says 60 days. So that means it'll take 60 days from planting to harvest. On the back, it has the depth that you should plant the seed, the temperature that it needs to germinate, how many days till germination, etc. And it also tells you when to plant. So for tomatoes, when it says sowing outdoors, it says sowing indoors, I'm sorry. Plant it 6 to 8 weeks before our average last frost. In Corvallis, that's around April 28th. So you'd want to start those indoors, counting 6 weeks back from April 28th. And you'll notice it says direct seeding outdoors, not recommended. So Territorial Seeds, which is in Cottage Grove, knows what things will succeed and what's a recipe for failure. Next slide. When you buy seeds, if you have leftovers like those zucchini seeds, you can save them for subsequent years. They will germinate best in that year that they were packed for. For example, that tomato seed packet that we just looked at said packed in 2010. That's an old slide. That means it germinates best in 2010. It doesn't mean it won't germinate in 2011, but it's best in 2010. If you have extra seeds, just store them in a cool, dark place in something that's pretty airtight, Tupperware container, glass jar. It's a good idea to put one of those little silica packets like you get in your pills or in your shoebox when you get new shoes, to put that in with the seeds. That helps keep it dry. Next slide. So when you've planted your seeds, or you're about to plant your seeds, what you need to know is the things about what's required for it to germinate. Well, at first, it needs moisture and warmth. Next slide. But how warm? That depends on the seed. This is a list of minimum soil temperatures for germination, and there's a wide range of temperatures. So I pointed out two. Notice corn needs soil temperature to be 60 to 65 degrees, whereas peas, 34 to 36 degrees. So my peas are in the ground. It was the soil temperature was 40 degrees when I planted those, but it's far too early for a lot of these other plants. Next slide. So remember, we're talking about soil temperature, not the air temperature. So one way to tell the soil temperature is to get yourself a soil thermometer. This is my soil thermometer. You just stick it in the ground and it tells you what the soil temperature is. So that's one way to tell when to plant. Next slide. Other ways, if you don't have a soil thermometer and you don't want to buy one, the seed packets will tell you that in one way or another. On the right is a package that comes from Territorial Seeds. Since they're in they're in the Willamette Valley, they know what month. So they will say here, direct sow, the arrow's pointing to direct sow from March through mid-July. This is carrots we're talking about. Oh, notice up here in the right-hand corner, it says pack for 2017. So that means it's going to do best in that year. Over on the left, I think this is botanical interest, but it doesn't say a month. It says recommended 2 to 4 weeks before your average last frost. So you can tell when to plant other ways besides having a soil thermometer. Okay, next slide. How you plant, it depends on the seed, type of seed too, and your own preference to some extent. Some people like to plant things in nice straight rows. Other folks plant things in bands, and that works well for things like lettuce, spinach, carrots. The only thing you have to do there is be sure and thin it so they're not too crowded. Plants like zucchini, cucumbers, things that have big bushy plants, you plant, they call it in hills. You don't necessarily have to have it in a hill, but you need to have them spaced out pretty far apart. Next slide. So that's on top of the soil. How deep do you plant them? Well, remember the seed packet's probably going to tell you, but the rule of thumb is you plant it about 3 times as deep as the seed is wide at its longest dimension. And that varies, of course. And it's kind of interesting to see the different, if you haven't grown some of these before, to see the size of the seed. So here's a seed for broccoli, little tiny, and then there's the seed for a radish, which is much smaller than broccoli, but a bigger seed. So you're not going to measure your seed with with a ruler. So you probably will go by what's on the seed packet, but that is the general rule. Next slide. When you're planting, remember you want to label what you're planting so you can find it. If weeds come up at the same time, you'd like to know where it is that you planted that kale or carrots or whatever. It's also a good idea to note when it was that you planted that vegetable, because you can have an idea of when you might be seeing something come up. If you know how many days it takes to germination and you've noted the date, you'll know when to start looking for something to appear. Next slide. Okay, now we'll look at a little demo of planting.
Okay.
There's just one more slide related to the seeding, and that is that when those little baby plants come up, including those beets that I just planted, especially beets and chard, you're going to need to thin. And you absolutely need to thin. You need to be kind of ruthless. I know you don't want to kill those little baby plants, but you have to, or you'll have carrots that are all twisted around each other and they're little tiny carrots. So do thin so that they're the distance apart. See on the package it says 1 to 3 inches apart. It's best, or I find it best, to snip it off at the ground level rather than pull out the plants that you're getting rid of, because you'll disturb the neighboring little carrots if you just rip them out. So cut it off. Next slide. Okay, transplanting, we'll cover briefly. Just a couple of things about transplants before we look at another quick video. It's really important to pick healthy transplants if you're going to use transplants. And here are examples of 2 tomato plants. And while a person might be tempted to pick the one on the left, if I were choosing one, I would pick the one on the right. And the reason is, one, The one on the left looks a little spindly. It's tall and it doesn't have a robust bunch of branches, kind of a skinny stem compared to the one on the right, but also the roots. It's a little root bound on the left. The roots have reached the bottom or kind of wrapping around. That probably indicates it should have been planted earlier. It's a little pot bound, whereas the one on the right, there's just a few roots that you can see. Next slide. Also, when you put them in the ground, make sure you put them far enough apart. It's hard sometimes because they're little baby plants and it looks like there's this humongous distance between the plants, but follow the footprint that you saw in your textbook and plant them 36 inches apart, or you can squeeze them a little closer together, but give them plenty of room. Otherwise, they're touching. There's a possibility, there's not good air movement. There's a possibility of mold or bacteria. So do spread them out in the beginning. One last thing about transplants is that you can grow your own transplants. And Judith made an excellent video on how to do that and save money, and it's fun doing it at home. The link, are you putting that in the chat, Judith?
I don't have it available right now.
Okay, well, we'll make it available to you.
We'll make it
Yeah.
available.
It's worth trying. It's kind of fun. So that's it.
Awesome.
So we have a chat question here. Should we break up the soil of a plant before putting it into the ground?
Oh, the soil that comes around the,
Mhm.
yeah, I usually loosen that. I don't know that I showed that here, but I usually loosen it up a little bit, yeah.
Very good. Any other questions in the chat or any questions somebody wants to ask? No, all questioned out. Okay, awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, then that actually wraps up our session for tonight. So thank you so much. If you do have questions, you're welcome to ask some more in the chat. I'll send out links to those videos and the other one that we mentioned by the weekend for sure, as well as the PowerPoint slides. And for next week, we'll be back same time next Tuesday, and we'll be talking about watering, weeding, pests, and disease. So thank you all and have a lovely evening. And Master Gardeners, if you would stay on, that would be great.